Of all the Espada, perhaps none are as despicable as the 8th Espada, Szayelaporro Granz, who up until recently we only really knew to be the sadistic scientist of Aizen's army. However, of course, with the newest Bleach chapter finally here, he has been given a new lease on life, so to speak, as a denizen of hell who has returned to cause trouble for our heroes once more, who long thought him to be dead, along with us as readers. So I figured now that Szayelaporro has been once again thrust to the forefront of the community's collective subconscious, it was a great time to do a Bleach character analysis on this guy and see what really makes him tick. Before we begin, however, guys, we hit 80,000 subscribers just kind of out of nowhere. Like, I thought last video I was talking about 75,000, so again, just a massive thank you. That's all I can really say at this point, is just thank you so much for your continued and amazing support of my channel. I really, really appreciate it, and more than ever, 100,000 is looking so possible, which, you know, a few months ago even, I would never have dreamed of saying. So thank you so much for your continued support, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you know, be a part of the last wave of subs we really need to get to 100,000. I would really appreciate it. Hit that button now. And of course, you'll get Bleach content like this every single week. And if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button as well, because it really does support me and the videos by doing so. It really increases the exposure of the video and gets it out there to more people on YouTube, more Bleach fans like yourself who can partake in the discussion. And finally, if you do want to support the channel a little bit more, we do have a Patreon now as well, where you can support me for as little as $1 a month. Get early access to videos, and I'll just really be so grateful for that. And of course, a massive, massive thank you goes out to everyone who has already become a patron so far and has been for a while now. Just, I really appreciate your support, so thank you so much. So, Szayelaporro Granz, or as I used to call him way back in the day when I was reading this weekly, Zale. I think I got that completely wrong, and I also thought Aporo was just supposed to be his middle name, but apparently it's all one long first name, Szayelaporro, which actually makes way more sense because, let's face it, Kubo's naming conventions, particularly where the Espada are concerned, can be a little extreme. Any group that has a character in it called Aranero Ararueri is going to be trouble in that regard. But Szayelaporro is pretty popular, I think, as far as the Espada go, and I'm pretty certain Kubo really liked this character as well. Szayelaporro is one of the principal villains of the Hueco Mundo arc, kind of up there with characters like Noitara and even Grimjo as well. The three of them kind of share the spotlight. Aranero and Zomari are somewhat pushed aside in that sense, but Szayelaporro is definitely up there as one of the major bad guys of that invasion arc. Now, to me, it always felt like Szayelaporro, personally, really overstayed his welcome. It felt like he was around for absolutely ages. In retrospect, I don't think he really was, although for a character of his stature, he probably was in it for perhaps too long. He was only the 8th Espada after all, and when you see kind of how the top 3 Espada were treated, you can't help but think maybe Kubo spent a little bit too long on this guy. Szayelaporro's debut chapter is chapter 244, and the last time we see him alive in the canon manga anyway, this video will be about his canon manga story, as all my analysis videos are for characters, was chapter 306. Until recently, of course, now his manga lifespan stretches all the way to the newest chapter, which is kind of weird. But also prior to that, he appears as a hallucination to Mayuri in chapter 643. So this guy really gets around, and I think this reinforces the idea that Kubo loves this character because he appears in every story arc after his inception, apart from the Lost Agent, which is really impressive for essentially just a supporting villain. Moving on to Szayelaporro's character overview, his design and personality, and I'm prepared to potentially upset some people here, because I do think Szayelaporro is one of the more popular Espada, but to me, I just never really liked him that much, if I'm completely honest. I found him to be a little bit annoying, a bit drawn out. It felt like he was around, like I said, for ages, and really he actually was. I think when you kind of look at it, from a blown out view, he's in like 3 volumes continuously, about 30 chapters-ish. Zyle is a major feature of the series, potentially even longer than that. And I also found his fight with Mayuri to not be the most interesting thing in the world. However, these days I have grown to have more of an appreciation for both Szayel and Mayuri. Mayuri's now one of my favourite captains, whereas back when I was reading this weekly, he never quite resonated with me on that kind of a level, which I think probably affected my enjoyment of that fight overall. However, if we're to look at Szayelaporro's design, I really do love the simplicity here, and honestly Kubo nails all of the Espada designs, but it's just so great when you see these characters kind of together. They're all wearing essentially the same thing. They're all wearing these white and black uniforms. Each one is customized to meet everyone's individual needs, but then certain things about them stand out and make them very individual. Szayelaporro's shock of pink hair, of course, makes him immediately memorable. His bright yellow eyes. I love the touch that his hollow mask fragment is his glasses. That's absolutely lovely. And overall, he comes across as quite unassuming in comparison to a lot of the Espada anyway. You've got some regal-looking old guy with a massive crown on his head. You've got this deathly pale guy with a horn helmet and these bright green eyes. This super lanky guy with a big spoon attached to his back. And then you've got Szayelaporro, who is, in comparison, very meek and, like I said, unassuming. And that's definitely done on purpose, I think. You're supposed to kind of look at Szayel and think he's not really going to be much of anything, when in reality he houses perhaps the most depraved mind of all of the Espada, and that's one of the things I think is really cool about him. One lovely thing about both his design and personality that Kubo kind of fuses together is midway through his battle with Renji and Uryu when he goes and changes his outfit completely because this last one is destroyed. I think that's really nice, actually. Looking back now, it's such a lovely character moment. I kind of dig the cape. I think it looks pretty cool. Although it's weird that he then basically activates his resurrection immediately after changing, making his change pointless, but you know, whatever, that's fine. So I like Szayelaporro more now than I ever really did before. In many ways, he's a very similar character to Mayuri, because obviously Kubo was doing a lot of those mirror matches in the Arrancar arc. But in also many ways, he's very different. And of course, the core of that concept is personified in Mayuri's perfection speech, which we will obviously get into later. But there are other differences between them as well. Szayelaporro comes across, in my opinion, as incredibly green in comparison to Mayuri, and that's showcased in a number of different ways. So obviously, Szayelaporro has spent pretty much his entire time locked in Hueco Mundo, and this has severely affected his perception of the world and how much he actually knows. He comments that he's never met a Bankai user before, and he's also never met a Quincy before either, whereas Mayuri has met both. And, you get the impression that Mayuri is a much more seasoned scientist than Szayelaporro could ever hope to be at this point in the story. And I think that's kind of fascinating because Szayelaporro sees himself as so far above most other beings, which is a trait that is shared by Mayuri. But in Mayuri's case, you kind of get the sense that he can back it up, whereas Szayelaporro has a lot of very flashy abilities. But you'll see in the fight with Mayuri that they are rendered completely ineffective. And the fight is, again, something we'll get into. I think I have, again, slightly more of an appreciation for it now than I used to. But I think it does a great job of highlighting the differences between the two of them in that regard. Szayelaporro is also oddly vulgar, and he's very manic as well, and I think that's supposed to be the hollow within, that's his hollow personality breaking through this facade of a civilized man. He screams and rants at these guys when he manages to get one up on them. There's a great moment where, I think it's when Uryu shoots Szayel through the throat with Sail Schneider and it blows up. And Szayel's just like, I managed to nullify it, you idiot. And he gives him this rude hand gesture, which I completely forgot about when I read read the volume again. I was like, wow, okay. Because it kind of does feel like it sort of comes out of nowhere, but then you can kind of see the cracks forming in Szayel's facade, and I actually like that. Although Mayuri can be quick to rage, particularly earlier on in the story when he is kind of subverted in a way perhaps he wasn't expecting, the vulgarity isn't really his thing, and that does kind of highlight Szayel's immaturity, in my opinion anyway, when he's very quick to just completely lose his mind, which is something he does a couple of times throughout. So if we move on to Szayelaporro's plot overview, and much like many members of the Espada, Szayelaporro suffers from only really existing when it's his turn to fight. Now, of course, Kubo has kind of done away a little bit with that with Szayel by including him in the newest chapter, but many of the Espada only really exist as characters when they have to fight, and that means that they will invariably die as well, which is a huge shame, and I'd have loved to have seen more from them on the outside. However, we do get a tiny bit more of Szayel. He is intimately connected to the whole Neutra and Neliel flashback, and that subplot that goes on, which I actually really enjoy. You get a really nice moment with him and Neutra. Szayelaporro is the one who essentially helps Neutra kick Nell out of Hueco Mundo by developing technology that basically creates like this fake version of Neutra that she tries to attack and he disappears. And I actually really like Szayelaporro's appearance in the past as well. I think he kind of looks cooler in the past, although I'm hesitant to say that since we can barely really see him, but he does look pretty neat. But it's cool that he plays that role in getting Nell kicked out, and therefore he has some kind of additional depth when that storyline comes around a little bit later on. It's also intriguing to note that he was demoted from the Espada at this point in the story as well, and we know of course that Neutra is currently the 8th Espada during the Neliel flashback, so presumably over time he was promoted to a higher rank and Szayelaporro took that rank that Neutra once had. But it is cool to kind of see them interact. Szayelaporro is absolutely not the deepest character in the series, and he doesn't get any other backstory outside of this, really. But it's cool to see him interacting with Neutra a little bit. You kind of get the idea that they are probably some of the more unpleasant members in Hueco Mundo, and they want things very much to be their way. We do get a small hint of an additional subplot with Szayelaporro before his battle. After the Privarone Espada are killed, Aizen kind of summons this messenger and to tell him, like, you know, why were the Exequias summoned? To kind of clean up the messes, and Szayelaporro reveals that he's the one who sent them out there. And of course this ties in eventually to the mystery of Szayelaporro's lab, which was a huge mystery that hung over the story for a very long time. There's a really nice moment here where it feels like Aizen and Szayelaporro are trying to feel each other out a little bit, and Szayelaporro is obviously very much on the back foot. He's very apologetic, kneeling before his master. And Aizen, as he always does, plays it off as not a big deal, but there's a hint of malice underlying everything. I do kind of wonder what the purpose of this scene really is, other than maybe to set up the lab stuff later on, because it's just a little bit strange, and I wonder if maybe Kubo had a little bit more planned in the future and decided not to go there. But I do like this scene. It's actually kind of rare to get a moment where Aizen speaks to one of the Espada in a one-on-one situation. But regardless, it is really cool to see. But then we move on to the fights as Renji and Dondachaka fall into Szayelaporro's lair, essentially. And this is around about the time Rukia is finishing up her battle with Aronniero. So chronologically, Szayelaporro is one of the earliest Espada to actually fight. It's just that his fight lasts so long, it eclipses Grimjo's battle and Zamari's battle, meaning that despite being the 8th Espada, he is about the 4th to actually be defeated. Of course, Yami is not around yet either at the moment. Now, I do kind of like the Renji and Uryu versus Szayelaporro fight. It's a nice battle. The partnership between Renji and Uryu is quite unexpected, and Szayelaporro does look pretty good in this fight. Much better than he looks later on with Mayuri anyway. And there's just some really nice choreography in this battle altogether. Obviously, an absolute favourite moment of mine is the team-up, the combo move between Renji and Uryu when Renji wraps Szayelaporro in Zabimaru, hits him point-blank in the face with a Shakuho. Szayelaporro staggers out like, how dare you attack me like that? How dare you do something so reckless and, you know, damage me in this way? Not realising he has stepped right into Uryu's trap, Uryu activates Sprenger and blows Szayelaporro to hell, essentially. However, Szayelaporro does actually survive this combo, which I think kind of goes some way to both proving his durability, but also not really, because he looks pretty worse for wear, particularly in the manga. He looks really messed up by this combo move, like he's on death's door at this point. Now, obviously, using Resurrection heals all wounds. That's not what he does here, but he could do that theoretically. But yeah, he's looking pretty rough, and Renji and Uryu are not the strongest fighters in the world, so that does kind of go some way to showing you Szayelaporro's vulnerabilities as one of the lower level Espada. There are some interesting moments slightly early on, like very early on, when it's just Renji in the room, and Szayel announces himself as the 8th Espada, and Renji's kind of cocky about it, thinking you're not that powerful, and Zayel's like, yeah, I'm not really, I'm just a researcher. Very much luring Renji into a false sense of security, but it is quite a nice thing to say. And again, that's where Zayel's design comes from. He is very unassuming. You can imagine Renji arriving on the battlefield. You know, Renji himself is quite rugged, outwardly looks quite strong, quite feral. His Zanpakuto toe is this serrated blade whip thing. And you're faced with Szayelaporro, who's this tiny little bookish man who has glasses on, very small frame, and Renji's probably thinking he's hit the jackpot. There are some, I do think, I would probably call them inconsistencies, maybe, oddities perhaps. Szayelaporro being able to simply bat away Zabimaru seems ludicrous to me, and I know that Renji is not that powerful in the Arrancar arc, let's face it, or at the very least he's given a pretty bad rap. But Szayelaporro being able to just knock it aside has always seemed kind of weird to me, although that potentially is just set up for the combo, so it could be that Renji wasn't really putting a lot of effort into it. But regardless, I do like the fight. I do like that they have a nice bit of banter between them. I like it when Szayelaporro tells all of his fraction to shut up when Uryu's trying to speak. That's a nice moment as well. I absolutely love it when Uryu fires the Sail Schneider through Szayelaporro's throat. If I'm remembering rightly, it's through his gut in the anime, and that's something we'll actually get into in a minute. But Szayelaporro's thing very early on seems to be the nullification of abilities by analysing data. When Renji first uses Bankai, it immediately just disappears, and Szayelaporro reveals that he's able to get rid of it because he already knows what it is, thanks to the surveillance bugs that he kind of had, the surveillance he had in his brother Il-Forte Granz, who fought Renji much earlier in the arc. The logistics of Shinigami having siblings is already slightly weird. The logistics of a Hollow having a brother is, in my opinion, even weirder. Personally, I don't think it makes sense at all, because Hollows are kind of supposed to be an amalgamation of loads of souls, and I think we can reasonably assume that Szayelaporro, the man, is a single soul that became dominant. That's what I think, anyway. That Szayelaporro was a person in life, and his soul became dominant. So maybe they just happened to find each other, and Il-Forte is actually his brother from when they were alive, or they're just two Hollows who maybe figured they shared similar goals, similar outlooks, and decided to consider themselves siblings. Either way, their relationship's clearly not that healthy. Szayelaporro did try and save Il-Forte after the fight, but I think he kind of just considered him to be dead weight. I think he says something like, I'm not going to cry over my broken toys or something like that, which is pretty messed up. And Szayelaporro is a pretty messed up guy. And then, of course, later on, when he negates Uryu's Sail Schneider, he says that he got the data to do that from Uryu's battle with Tsuruchi. So this is very much Szayelaporro's thing early on in the fight. Now, before we move on to the next part of the fight, Szayelaporro is the victim of some pretty hefty censorship in the Bleach anime, more so than a lot of characters. In so many ways, Szayelaporro strikes me as perhaps being more instinctive than so many of the Espada, living on this kind of primal basis while pretending or trying to be a very civilized intellectual. So I think when he gets shot by Sail Schneider, if I'm remembering it rightly, it doesn't go through his neck in the anime, and you certainly don't see it either. It's like one of those black silhouette moments, whereas in the manga you full on get a close-up of it going through his throat. You know me at this point. I'm a manga purist. I would always recommend the manga first, at least, over the anime, because it's it's the best way to digest the series in its purest form. And there's stuff like this where that's just very impactful. Seeing it hit Szayel like that in the throat and then he gets rid of it is a lovely moment. After he is severely damaged by the combination attack, he devours one of his Fraction Lumina, which again is a very Hollow-like thing to do. And I think it's a real moment of like naked exposure for this character. He reveals what he really is inside, which is this Hollow-like monster, essentially. In the manga, he like basically rips Lumina apart and like bites into her and stuff, and just like you actually see him eating it. At one point you see him holding what's left of her body and like her arm is hanging out of his mouth. He looks animalistic, which is obviously the idea. In the anime they don't do that, and I've got to be honest, I'm kind of surprised. I actually kind of think that this was a point in Bleach's anime run where it was, very, very popular, very mainstream, and they were really toning down a lot of it. And he just sort of grabs Lumina in the anime and turns her into like this ball of Reiatsu, or Reishi, which he then just takes a bite out of like an apple. It's obviously not as effective, but it's essentially the same thing. And then, of course, one of the biggest parts of censorship, which I think is just so unheard of in the series, is actually completely changing the name of his Zanpakuto toe. In the English version, certainly the one I've got, his Zanpakuto toe is La Lujuriosa, which I believe is literally just the lustful or something like that. Whereas in Japanese, and the real name of his Zanpakuto toe, which we would always refer it as, is Fornicarous, which obviously has very sexual meaning, connotations. And so for them to change his Zanpakuto name entirely, I think is a pretty big step to make. And it's not something you ever really see again, I don't think, if I remember rightly. So it's kind of fascinating seeing just how much this character is actually affected by censorship. And then later on, I forgot about that. It literally just came to me. Later on, there's a moment where, which we'll get to, but Szayelaporro uses an ability called Gabriel, and it's totally censored in the anime, which we can get to in a sec. But for now, let's move on with the rest of the fight. Now, I have to say, I actually do quite like Szayelaporro's resurrection. I think it looks really cool. It's obviously got a sort of angelic but parasitic theme to it, which is really awesome. And I think its abilities are, on the whole, extremely creative, particularly the ability where he envelopes a character in his wings and then creates like a voodoo doll sort of kind of thing. I think that's really creative, although I don't know how Uryu survives having his entire stomach destroyed. But, that's not important. It happens either way. But it's still really cool. Basically, Szayelaporro, it is essentially like a voodoo doll. He flicks the doll and Uryu feels the flick against his head. There's a funny moment where he pulls the doll in half and they think that Uryu's about to pop in half and he's just like, this is just how the doll works, you idiots. Which is funny, I like that. And then inside are these tablets which are Uryu's internal organs, and he crushes the stomach and Uryu just blood comes out of his mouth like mad. Like I said, I think he probably would be dead at that point, but it's a really nice idea. It's a really cool visual. And Szayelaporro is just completely in control of the fight at this point. His resurrection is pretty powerful, all things considered. He even can do this thing where he shoots gunk out of his back, which creates all these clones. Yeah, he's pretty tough. And there's a nice moment where you kind of see the dichotomy between good guy and bad guy here, where Szayelaporro, there's one remaining Renji clone, and Szayelaporro just clicks and its head blows up, and Renji's even though it wasn't real, it feels weird to see that. I'm not a fan of that. And it just kind of shows Szayela's overall sort of contempt for anything remotely living. Of course, it's around this time that Mayuri Kurotsuchi arrives in Hueco Mundo. And like I said, I was never the biggest fan of this fight, to be totally honest with you. I think it's horribly one-sided, to the point of having no tension whatsoever. And it's very much just Kubo having a ton of fun with one of his absolute favourite characters. But in my opinion, this fight kind of pushes the Mayuri preparedness a little bit too far. There's one moment which just encompasses Mayuri and Kubo's approach to the character as a whole in one fell swoop. And that's when Szayel is like crushing all of Mayuri's organs and nothing is happening. And he's just like, why won't you die? And Mayuri's just like, well, I was watching your battle through Uryu, and before I came here, I replaced all of my internal organs. You know, I can't be killed. And Szayel's just like, that's absolutely not possible. And Mayuri, and by extension Kubo's own response, is literally just, if it wasn't possible, I wouldn't be here. And there's no explanation for like how he's surviving this. There's no explanation for how he did it and how he did it so fast as well. You just have to accept it because it's him. And that's kind of what Kubo is saying here. And I do both kind of like that and not really. But it is funny because Szayelaporro has been very smug up until this point. That's possibly the best Mayuri troll in the series. It's, you know, there's just no explanation. It's just Mayuri madness. And I kind of like that. So Mayuri has Szayel devoured by his Bankai, Konjiki, Ashisogi, Jizo. And it's at this point that Szayelaporro uses his Gabriel ability. Basically, Szayelaporro is able to impregnate someone and use their body as a host to respawn himself, basically. He uses that body as a host like a parasite and emerges from them fully reborn, you know, like a phoenix from the ashes. And according to him, the fact that he has this power, this Gabriel ability, makes him immortal and therefore, in his words, a perfect being. He has achieved perfection. And again, Gabriel is heavily censored in the anime. In the manga, you see Nemu kind of become impregnated, essentially. She looks pregnant. And then Szayel's whole body just like falls out of her mouth. It is kind of gross. I'm not gonna lie. We know that Kubo adores body horror. He loves body horror, creepy looking things. And this is pretty messed up. The Arrancar arc was not as bad for it as the 1,000-Year Blood War. And it's kind of not surprising they censored this. Like, his whole body just kind of comes out of her mouth, very much like a parasite. And he is reborn. Whereas in the anime, they go like a long way to show like an egg, kind of a reishi egg, like float out of her mouth, and then he reforms from that in the air. And she obviously doesn't look quite as desiccated as she does in the manga either after he's finished. Honestly, I think Gabriel is a pretty interesting ability, despite Mayuri's insistence on the contrary. I think it is pretty cool. We've never really seen anything like this before. Could he resurrect himself indefinitely? Nemu does look pretty, like I said, desiccated after this, so it's hard to imagine she would be able to go through that again, but I guess it's possible. It obviously gets completely eclipsed much later on in the series when you have characters like Gerard Valkyrie who can just resurrect after they're killed. But back here it was a pretty big deal, but Mayuri laughs it off in, again, another fantastic Mayuri moment where he's like, is that really, you know, all you've got? You know, it doesn't do anything else. You just come back to life. And it's great seeing Szayelaporro get more and more frustrated as the time goes on. Szayel takes control of Mayuri's Bankai and tries to get it to eat Mayuri in a very last-ditch attempt to win the fight, I think, but it blows up because, again, Mayuri is prepared for that and has a fail-safe if his Bankai turns on him. And actually, I think that one is fair enough. It's at this point, however, that Szayelaporro has lost the fight unknowingly. Having spawned himself from Nemu's body, he has accidentally infected himself with a drug, one of which Mayuri keeps an awful lot of them inside her. And the drug that he has been infected with is the superhuman drug, which basically slows time for him on a massive scale. So, you know, it's a bit of a trope in superhuman kind of stories and stuff like that. If someone has superhuman reflexes, they can, you know, see a punch slow to a crawl in front of them and counter. That's how they're so strong. This is what Szayel is now going through, but amplified to about like 1 million or something insane. Every single movement feels like it takes a literal century for him. He tries to lift his hand up, and to Mayuri and everyone else, he's lifting his hand up at a normal pace. But to Szayelaporro, it's like the smallest, slightest, incremental movement. And it's truly horrifying. You know, this is a great example of the terror of Mayuri and why you should not mess with this guy. And he's so nonchalant about it as well. Like, he's just like, well, you know, you've got this drug in you now. Everything's probably moving pretty slowly. Kubo does this really cool thing where Mayuri's voice just starts to slur and go really weird for Szayel. And it's a horrifying, terrifying end. There's no denying that Szayelaporro is a twisted person, but it's pretty messed up. You get this lovely moment where Mayuri has, like, stabbed him through the hand, which is something he won't feel for, in Szayel time, centuries. And he's pushing the blade towards his heart. And you get this great moment where you see an elderly Szayelaporro, like, beneath the beating sun of the desert. And he's like, how long have I been here? You know, like, how long has it been? Set me free from this pain. You know, he's like, let the sword stab my heart and kill me and put me out of my misery. But in reality, it's been about a minute. It's horrible. It's totally horrible, but really creative and honestly really effective as well. And I actually really do quite like it as the end of the fight. Mayuri does eventually stab Szayel in the heart and finishes him off, but for Szayel, that's like hundreds of years in the future for him. So yeah, it's really trippy, but it's some of Mayuri's best work. And then, of course, at the end of the fight, Mayuri gives Szayelaporro his perfection speech, which is a seminal moment for the character of Mayuri, more important for him, really, than it is for Szayelaporro. It gives you much more of an insight into Mayuri's character than it does anything else. He's just admonishing Szayel, mostly for what I said earlier about Szayel's overall immaturity as a scientist, his lack of worldly experience making him blinded by his own ego and his own complacency. So this is something we'll go into a lot more in an eventual Mayuri video, but it's very telling. Mayuri says to him basically, like, you said you were a perfect being. I spit on perfection. Perfection is a dead end. It means we can't go any further. And as a scientist, you should be always striving to go further. You should always be looking for that next thing. If you reach that dead end, you have no purpose. You know, what are you with perfection? Nothing. And that's basically what he's saying to Szayelaporro. He's saying because you thought that you achieved perfection, you had reached the very apex of what you can achieve. And so what else do you have to live for? You know, what are you? And he says, like, for scientists like us, perfection is a disease. And then he kind of side-eyes Szayel and gives him one last, you know, if you really are a scientist. Obviously showing a lot of contempt for Szayel. The moment he mentioned the whole perfect being thing, Mayuri was probably like, this guy is in way over his head, has absolutely no idea what he is getting himself into. And you can kind of get the idea of maturity from this speech. You can just imagine Szayel waffling on and on about perfection and Mayuri sitting there like, yeah, this guy's going to die. He's probably sitting there like, he's just got no idea. You know, you should always be striving for more. And of course, Kubo brings this back around in a lovely way in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc when Szayelaporro reappears as a hallucination after the death of Nemu, puts himself down in front of Mayuri and he's like, did you think that she was perfect? Is that why you're so sad? Why you're so heartbroken? Because you thought that puppet of yours was perfect after you told me that perfection is a disease, something to be spat on. Now look at you, look how far you've fallen. Szayel was like, you should be grateful to the left arm of God because, it's removed that thing from your life. You can now strive for something better. Lovely, very, very unexpected callback and an honestly wonderful way to humble Mayuri a bit after he was obviously getting a little big for his boots. And Mayuri in the 1,000-Year Blood War, we've already talked about it once in a video, but there's a separate video I do want to make in the future. But needless to say, he's very smug in the 1,000-Year Blood War, very on top of his game, and it's very nice to see Szayelaporro come in, knock him down a peg, even in death. It's just lovely as well that Mayuri hasn't forgotten him either. I think that's really great. And I do wonder if maybe they'll clash again in this potential Hell arc. But that remains to be seen. And that's pretty much it for the character of Szayelaporro Granz. I really hope you enjoyed this video. The last thing we have to go through really is Szayela's relationships. And we've kind of talked about his relationship with Mayuri. The two of them share very broad similarities. Szayelaporro as an Espada, his aspect of death is madness, and obviously that fits him very well. It also fits Mayuri very well, and that's probably the key similarity between the two of them, is that they are the mad scientist trope. But I think Mayuri definitely looks upon Szayel with disdain for who he thinks he is and who he wants to be. And then the other relationship is really just ill-fought, because unfortunately a lot of the Espada don't have too many relationships. There are very, very small things you could talk about. Noitara, the fact that they had clearly some kind of working relationship that doesn't seem to have really carried over much into the present day. And yeah, there's not really a relationship between him and Ilfort either. It's more just the intriguing question of how the hell does a Hollow have a brother? But other than that, that's basically it for the character of Szayelaporro Granz. Of course, he does reappear in the newest chapter of Bleach, so who knows if Kubo has more in store for him to come. I just hope we get a second chapter. I really do. I hope it comes soon as well. But yeah, let me know in the comments below, guys, what you think of Szayelaporro. Did you enjoy his character in the series? Was he your favourite Espada? Do let me know, and let me know what you thought of his fights as well. I'd absolutely love to know in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you haven't done already, guys. Keep pushing the channel to 100,000. I'd really appreciate the support. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.